The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and Nathan Caldwell answered it the same way he answered every call. Sitting upright, fully alert, his mind already running calculations before the voice on the other end had finished the first sentence. In 38 years of life, he had trained himself to feel nothing before he had all the facts. Panic was a luxury for people who couldn't afford to think clearly. Nathan could always afford to think clearly. It was, in many ways, the only thing he had ever truly been good at. But when the nurse said the words, "Your daughter isn't responding," every calculation in his mind went dark. He was in the car before she finished the sentence. The streets of Manhattan at 3 in the morning were almost beautiful, amber streetlights reflected in wet asphalt, the city breathing slowly for the first time in 24 hours. But Nathan saw none of it. He sat rigid in the back seat of the black SUV, his driver weaving through empty intersections, and he stared at his own hands resting on his knees. They were steady. He hated that they were steady. He wanted them to shake. He wanted to feel something that proved he was a father first and a CEO second. But his body had forgotten how to make that distinction years ago. Lily was 9 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had been sick for 14 months. It had started with fatigue, the kind that teachers notice before parents do. Her third-grade teacher, Mrs. Holloway, had sent a note home in October of the previous year saying that Lily had fallen asleep at her desk twice in 1 week. Nathan had read the note on a Thursday evening between 2 conference calls and had assumed it was a phase. Children got tired. Children had phases. He had hired a pediatrician to make house calls, and the pediatrician had said the same thing. Probably a virus, probably nothing. Give it 2 weeks. 2 weeks became 2 months. By December, Lily couldn't climb the stairs to her bedroom without stopping to rest on the landing. By January, she had been admitted to New York Presbyterian for the first time. By March, she had been admitted 3 more times, and the diagnosis still hadn't come. Not a real one. Not the kind that came with a treatment plan and a timeline and a percentage. Just theories. Just specialists passing her chart between them like something none of them wanted to hold for too long. Nathan had money. He had more money than most people could conceptualize. The kind of wealth that stopped being about objects and became about access, about the ability to open doors that didn't exist for anyone else. He had flown Lily to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, to a specialist in Boston who had published papers on rare autoimmune conditions in children and who had personally treated fewer than 40 patients in his career. He had paid for every test available. He had paid for tests that weren't yet widely available. He had paid for second opinions and third opinions, and opinions from people who weren't even directly in Lily's field of medicine, but who Nathan had been told were simply brilliant, the kind of brilliant that sometimes saw patterns others missed. None of them had seen the pattern. The working diagnosis, after 14 months, was a rare and poorly understood condition affecting the mitochondrial function of her cells. Her body, essentially, struggling to convert energy at the most fundamental biological level. The lead specialist, a composed and careful man named Dr. Hargrove, had sat across from Nathan in a consultation room 4 weeks earlier and had used the phrase, "managing expectations." Nathan had heard those words spoken in boardrooms before, usually right before someone told him a project was being shelved. He understood what they meant. They meant, we have done everything we know how to do. And now, at 3 in the morning, Lily wasn't responding. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. Nathan moved through them with the particular speed of a man who had memorized the layout of this building over the past year, which elevator to take, which wing, which nurse's station to pass without stopping. He knew the night staff by name. He knew which orderly worked the third-floor corridor on Tuesdays and which resident covered pediatrics on weekends. He had learned these things the way he learned everything, by paying attention, because attention was the one resource even his money couldn't substitute. Dr. Hargrove met him outside Lily's room. The expression on the doctor's face was careful and still, the face of a man who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned to do it without flinching. Nathan respected that, even now. He stood in the corridor in his dark suit and listened while Dr. Hargrove explained that Lily had experienced a significant episode. Her body's systems had faltered in a way that was more severe than previous episodes, and they had stabilized her, but the stability was fragile. The honest assessment, Dr. Hargrove said quietly, was that they were running out of options to try. Running out, Nathan repeated. We've consulted with every specialist we have access to through our network. The treatments we've attempted have provided limited relief, but haven't addressed the underlying progression. I think it's time we talked seriously about palliative. No. Nathan said the word without raising his voice. We're not having that conversation. Dr. Hargrove didn't argue. He had learned over the past year that Nathan Caldwell did not respond well to the word no coming from any direction, including from medical reality itself. He simply nodded and said he would give Nathan a few minutes, and he walked back down the corridor, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the low mechanical hum of the hospital at night. Nathan stood alone outside his daughter's room. Through the narrow window in the door, he could see the small shape of her beneath the blanket, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face too pale, too still. She looked like a child who was already somewhere else, already halfway through a door he couldn't follow her through. He pressed his hand flat against the wall beside the window. The plaster was cold. He stood there for a long time, long enough that one of the night nurses glanced at him as she passed and then looked quickly away, the way people looked away from grief when they didn't know what to do with it. He was still standing there when he heard the voice. "Excuse me, are you okay?" He turned. A woman was standing a few feet away, holding 2 paper cups of coffee, the kind that came from the vending machine on the second floor. She was wearing a beige knit sweater and jeans, her brown hair loose and slightly disheveled, and she had the specific look of someone who had been awake for a very long time and had stopped caring what that looked like. She was watching him with calm, steady eyes, not the careful professional stillness that the doctors wore, but something more direct than that, something honest. "I'm fine," he said. "You've been standing against that wall for 20 minutes, she said. "I've been down the hall." She extended one of the paper cups toward him. "I got 2 by accident. The machine gave me 2. You should take it." Nathan looked at the cup. He could not remember the last time a stranger had offered him something without wanting something in return. The geography of his life did not contain many moments like this one. "Thank you," he said, and he took it. "My son is in room 318, she said, nodding down the corridor. "His asthma flared up. He's fine. He's actually asleep now, which is more than I can say for myself." She glanced at the door Nathan had been standing outside. "Is yours okay?" He considered giving her the short answer. He was accustomed to the short answer. "She's being monitored. Thank you for asking." Instead, he said, "I don't know." The woman looked at him for a moment, and then she looked through the narrow window at Lily, and her expression shifted. Not to pity, which Nathan had grown to despise, but to something quieter and more genuine than that. "How long has she been sick?" she asked. 14 months, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's her name?" Lily. Something crossed the woman's face. A recognition, a reaction she controlled quickly but not quite quickly enough. She looked back at him, and her eyes were alert in a way they hadn't been a moment ago. "What condition?" she asked, and her voice had changed. It was focused now, careful. The voice of someone who had just heard something that meant more to them than they were ready to explain. Nathan studied her. "Why?" She hesitated. Then she said, "Because I'm a nurse and I've seen something like this before." Her name was Claire Merritt, and she was not the kind of person Nathan Caldwell would have ever noticed in any other context. That was not a cruel observation. It was simply true. Nathan moved through a world of tailored introductions, carefully curated professional networks, and rooms where everyone present had been selected for a reason. Claire existed in a different layer of the same city entirely. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, drove a 2017 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and packed her lunch every day because the hospital cafeteria was expensive, and her budget did not have room for expensive. She worked 12-hour shifts as a registered nurse in the pediatric unit at Elmhurst Hospital, and on the nights she wasn't working, she was usually home with her 7-year-old son, Mason, helping him with second-grade reading worksheets, or watching animated movies she had seen enough times to recite from memory. She had been a nurse for 9 years, She had become one for the same reason most people become nurses. Not because it was glamorous or well compensated, but because she could not imagine doing anything else. From the time she was a teenager, Claire had possessed an instinct for the sick that she couldn't fully explain and had stopped trying to. She noticed things. The slight change in a patient's color that came before a number changed on a monitor. The particular quality of a child's breathing that told her something was shifting hours before it became measurable. Her colleagues respected it and occasionally found it unsettling, the way people find unsettling anything that operates outside the boundaries of what can be taught. She had become a mother alone. Mason's father had left when Mason was 18 months old, not dramatically, not with shouting or broken dishes, but quietly, in the way of a man who had realized too late that the life he had agreed to was not the life he wanted. Claire had grieved that for approximately 4 months, and then she had stopped. Because Mason needed her to stop, and because she was at her core a person who moved forward. It was perhaps her defining characteristic. She moved forward, not without pain, not without exhaustion, but always forward. She had not expected to spend this particular Tuesday night in the corridor of New York Presbyterian. Mason's asthma attacks came without warning and always seemed to choose the worst possible timing. Tonight had hit just after 9 in the evening, bad enough that the inhaler hadn't done what it needed to do, and she had driven him across the bridge with one hand on the wheel and one hand reaching back to rub his shoulder, telling him in a steady voice that he was doing great, that he was breathing fine, that they were almost there. He was stabilized now. He was asleep. She was sitting in a corridor drinking terrible vending machine coffee and trying to let her heart rate return to normal. That was how she had ended up outside room 324. She had noticed the man before she spoke to him. It was hard not to notice him, standing utterly still against the wall with the particular frozen quality of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. She had seen that posture many times. It was the posture of parents in hospitals, but there was something about the intensity of it, the rigid control of it, that made her look twice. Now she was sitting in one of the corridor chairs across from Nathan Caldwell, though she didn't know his last name yet, didn't know anything about who he was outside this hallway, and he was telling her about Lily. He told her more than he intended to. That was the only explanation he could find afterward for why the conversation went the way it did. He was not a man who unburdened himself to strangers. He was not, if he was being honest, a man who unburdened himself at all. His ex-wife, Diane, had cited that specifically in the final conversation of their marriage, the one that had happened in the kitchen of their Upper East Side apartment on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago, with Lily at school and the coffee getting cold on the counter. "You don't let anyone in, Nathan. You never have. It's like trying to have a relationship with a building." He had not known how to argue with that because she wasn't wrong. But at 4 in the morning in this corridor, with a paper cup of bad coffee warming his hand, and a woman looking at him with eyes that asked nothing from him except honesty, he found himself talking. He described Lily's symptoms in the chronological order they had appeared, the fatigue, then the weakness, then the episodes, then the slow and devastating progression that 14 months of expert medical attention had failed to stop. He described the tests and the specialists and the theories and the consultations, and he described Dr. Hargrove's face 40 minutes ago in this corridor, the careful, composed face of a man whose toolkit was empty. Claire listened without interrupting. That was the first thing he noticed about her. She was a remarkable listener. Not the performed listening of people who were waiting for their turn to speak, but real attention. The kind that made you feel that what you were saying was being genuinely processed and considered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The mitochondrial diagnosis. Did they specify which type?" He blinked. "They mentioned something called MELAS. One of the specialists in Boston raised it. It was treated as a possibility, not a confirmed—" "MELAS," she repeated. She said it quietly, almost to herself, and he watched something move across her face, a complex expression he couldn't fully read, equal parts recognition and hesitation. "Mitochondrial encephalomyopathy, lactic acidosis, and stroke-like episodes. You know it." "I've seen one case," she said. "One. 18 months ago. a 6-year-old girl who was admitted to my unit. She had been through a cycle very similar to what you're describing. Exhaustion, progressive weakness, episodes that couldn't be fully explained, specialists who were treating individual symptoms without reaching the underlying cause. She paused. She had been deteriorating for almost a year. What happened to her? Claire looked at him steadily. She got better. The words landed in the corridor between them like something physical. Nathan set his coffee cup down on the chair beside him. How? He asked. There was a nutritional protocol, Claire said. It's not new. It's actually been studied since the 90s. But it's not standard practice because the research base is still considered limited by most major institutions. High-dose CoQ10, riboflavin, L-carnitine, combined with specific dietary modifications. It's sometimes called the mitochondrial cocktail. The girl's mother had researched it independently and brought it to the attending physician, who was initially resistant. She stopped. I was the one who told the mother to push harder, to not let it go. Nathan was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in the short time she'd known him, something open, something unguarded. And the attending eventually agreed? After 3 weeks of the mother not backing down, yes. A small, dry smile crossed her lips. The mother was very persistent. Did it work? It took 2 months to see meaningful improvement, but yes, it worked. She folded her hands in her lap. I don't want to give you false hope. MELAS presents differently in different patients, and what worked in that case won't necessarily translate directly. But the fact that your daughter's diagnosis has floated around that territory, and no one has apparently raised this protocol with you, that concerns me. Nathan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. Dr. Hargrove has been treating her for 8 months. In all that time, he never mentioned this. Major institutions tend toward caution with protocols that don't have large-scale trial data. It's not negligence, it's the way medicine is structured. But it means that sometimes the people who know about the outliers are the nurses who've stood at the bedsides and watched what actually happens when the textbook options run out. He looked at her for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? The question surprised her. She thought about it honestly. Because you're a father standing outside your daughter's room at 4 in the morning, she said. And you looked like someone who needed to know there was still a door left to open. He was quiet for a long time. The hospital hummed around them. The distant beep of monitors, the soft footfall of a nurse at the far end of the corridor, the particular deep silence of a building full of people sleeping through their own crises. I don't know your name, he said finally. Claire, she said. Claire Merritt. He extended his hand. And she shook it, and it occurred to her only later, much later, that it was a strangely formal thing to do at 4 in the morning in a hospital corridor, and that it had felt, despite everything, like the beginning of something. She didn't know yet how right she was, and she didn't know yet what that beginning was going to cost her. The next morning, Claire went home to Astoria, made Mason breakfast, dropped him at school, and told herself the conversation in the corridor had been exactly what it appeared to be. A chance encounter between 2 tired people in a hospital hallway, the kind that happens and then dissolves, leaving nothing behind except the faint warmth of having been briefly kind to a stranger. She told herself this while she made coffee. She told herself this while she sat at her kitchen table and stared at the wall. She stopped telling herself this around noon, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "This is Nathan Caldwell," the voice said. She had given him her number. She remembered doing it. She had written it on the back of a receipt she found in her jacket pocket, which was the least impressive business card exchange in history, and she had handed it to him when they parted ways at 5 in the morning. She had done it automatically, the way she gave her number to patients' families who needed a follow-up contact, and she had not fully considered what it meant until this moment, sitting in her kitchen in Queens with a coffee cup halfway to her mouth. "I remember," she said. "I spoke with Dr. Hargrove this morning," Nathan said. "I raised the protocol you described, the mitochondrial cocktail, the supplementation approach, the dietary modifications." A pause. He was not receptive. Claire set her cup down. What did he say? He said the evidence base was insufficient to justify introducing a non-standard protocol given Lily's current fragility. He said the risk of disrupting her existing medication balance outweighed the potential benefit. He said, Nathan stopped. When he continued, his voice was carefully flat. The way voices got when the person speaking them was working very hard to stay composed. He said he understood my desire to explore every option, but that at this stage, his responsibility was to keep her comfortable. Comfortable. Claire closed her eyes briefly. She knew what that word meant in a hospital context. She had used it herself in the careful, compassionate way that medical professionals used it when they were preparing families for an ending. Nathan, she said, I have to be honest with you about something. Go ahead. I'm a nurse at Elmhurst. I'm not on Lily's care team. I'm not on staff at New York Presbyterian. I have no formal standing in her case, and if I push myself into it without being asked through the right channels, I could create problems for her care, for the hospital relationship, and professionally for me. She paused. I want to help, but I need you to understand what the limits of that look like from where I'm standing. There was a silence on the line. What would help look like if those limits didn't exist? He asked. It was a precise question. She respected it. She thought about it honestly for a moment before she answered. I would want to review her full chart, not the summary, the actual documentation, every test result, every specialist note, every medication log. I would want to talk to the nurse who's been on her care most consistently, because nurses document things that don't always make it into physician summaries. And I would want to contact Dr. Priya Anand at Columbia University Medical Center, because she's one of the few physicians in this city who has published actual clinical work on the nutritional protocol approach in pediatric mitochondrial cases, and she is not affiliated with New York Presbyterian, which means Dr. Hargrove's institutional caution doesn't bind her. Another silence, longer this time. How do you know about Dr. Anand? Because when that little girl recovered 18 months ago, I went home and spent 3 weeks reading everything I could find about what had happened to her. I wanted to understand it. I'm a nurse. Understanding things is how I cope. She said it simply, without self-consciousness. Dr. Annan's name came up in every serious piece of research on the subject. Can you get a meeting with her? I can try to contact her. Whether she takes the meeting depends on whether Lily's case interests her clinically. Claire hesitated. It also depends on whether you're willing to use your own standing to request that New York Presbyterian facilitate a formal outside consultation. That's the legitimate path. If you push for it as her father, as the person responsible for her care, they can't easily refuse. They won't like it, but they can't refuse. I've been refusing to let them refuse things for 14 months, Nathan said. That's not new territory. Despite everything, Claire almost smiled. No, she said. I don't imagine it is. She contacted Dr. Priya Anand's office that afternoon. She expected to leave a message with a receptionist and wait several days. Instead, she was put through to Dr. Anand's research coordinator, a brisk young man named David, who asked her to summarize the case in 3 minutes. Claire summarized it in 2.5. David put her on hold for 4 minutes and then came back and said Dr. Anand would review the case files if they were sent to her office by end of week and would make a determination about a consultation from there. It was not a yes, but it was a door that hadn't been opened that morning. The files went to Dr. Annan's office on Thursday. On Friday, Nathan called Claire again. She was at work this time, in the middle of a shift, and she stepped into the medication room to take the call with her back against the cabinet and one eye on the window into the corridor. She wants to meet, Nathan said. Monday morning, she's coming to New York Presbyterian to review Lily's chart in person and speak with Dr. Hargrove. That's good, Claire said. That's genuinely good. She asked if you would be present. Claire went still. I'm sorry. She reviewed the summary you sent to her coordinator. She wants to speak with the nurse who identified the case parallel. Her words. A beat. She said, and I'm quoting here, that the clinical instinct in the summary was sharper than most physician referrals she receives. Claire stood in the medication room for a moment, processing this. I can't just walk into New York Presbyterian for a consultation on a patient I have no formal relationship with. I've already spoken to the Chief of Pediatrics, Nathan said. I've requested that you be formally included in the Monday consultation as an outside clinical advisor. They've agreed. She opened her mouth. She closed it. You did that this morning? I did that an hour ago. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there in their first conversation, a quality she couldn't immediately name, something less armored than before. Claire, I know this is outside normal procedure. I know I'm asking you to step into something that could be complicated for you professionally. But my daughter has been in that hospital for 14 months, and nobody has said her name the way you did last night, like she was a person, not a case. I don't know how to do nothing when someone offers me a door. She thought about Mason, asleep in the seat beside her as she drove through the dark toward the bridge. She thought about the way she had held his shoulder and told him he was doing fine. She thought about the 6-year-old girl who had gotten better, and the mother who had refused to stop pushing, and the 3 weeks she had spent reading everything she could find because understanding was how she survived things. Monday morning, she said. What time? 8 o'clock. I'll be there. She hung up and stood in the medication room for another moment. Then she went back to her shift, because there were 4 other patients who needed her, and the corridor didn't wait for anyone to finish being overwhelmed. The Monday consultation lasted 3 hours. Dr. Priya Anand was a small, precise woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and a manner that reminded Claire of a surgeon operating in very limited space. Every movement deliberate, nothing wasted. She reviewed Lily's chart with the kind of attention that made Dr. Hargrove visibly uncomfortable, asking questions that were pointed without being aggressive, identifying gaps in the documentation with the practiced calm of someone who had seen these gaps before and knew exactly what they meant. At one point, Dr. Anand looked up from the chart and looked directly at Claire. You noted in your summary that the episodic pattern shows a correlation with high physical activity in the 48 hours preceding each major event, she said. That's not documented anywhere in the physician notes. It was in the nursing logs, Claire said. 3 of the 5 major episodes were preceded by periods of increased exertion. I flagged it in the summary because the pattern seemed relevant to energy metabolism. Dr. Anand looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was the clinical equivalent of a nod. Then she turned back to the chart. At the end of the 3 hours, Dr. Anand set the file down on the table and folded her hands and looked at Nathan directly. I want to start her on the protocol, she said, but I need to tell you both something first, something that changes the shape of this conversation considerably. The room went very quiet. I've reviewed 14 months of documentation, Dr. Anand said, and I believe Lily's primary diagnosis has been wrong from the beginning. The silence that followed Dr. Anand's words was the kind that fills a room completely, pressing against the walls, making the air feel heavier than it had been a moment before. Nathan sat very still. Claire felt her breath catch in her chest and held it there without meaning to. Even Dr. Hargrove, who had been maintaining the careful composure of a man defending territory he wasn't entirely certain was still his, went very quiet. What do you mean, wrong from the beginning? Nathan asked. His voice was steady. Claire had come to recognize that steadiness for what it was. Not calm, but the precise opposite of calm, held in place by will alone. Dr. Anand opened the chart again and turned it so that both Nathan and Claire could see the page she was pointing to. The Millas hypothesis was raised in March and never formally confirmed or ruled out, she said. What happened instead was a common and understandable pattern. Once a working diagnosis enters a chart, subsequent observations get interpreted through that lens. Physicians are not immune to this. We see what we expect to see. She moved her finger to a cluster of test results near the bottom of the page. But when I look at this sequence of metabolic panels alongside the nursing observations that Claire flagged, particularly the correlation between exertion and episode onset, I see something that points in a different direction. Which is? Nathan asked. A condition called CPVT, Dr. Anand said. Catecholaminergic polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. It's a rare cardiac arrhythmia triggered by physical or emotional stress. In children, It is frequently misread as a neurological or metabolic disorder in its early stages, because the cardiac events can be subtle, and because the fatigue and weakness that result from repeated episodes mimic other conditions convincingly. She paused. It is serious, but it is treatable. With the right medication, in most cases, beta blockers combined with careful activity management, the majority of children with CPVT live full normal lives. Nathan was looking at the chart. His jaw was tight. 14 months, he said. 14 months, and no one caught this. CPVT is rare enough that it doesn't appear high on most differential lists, Dr. Anand said, and her voice was honest without being defensive. It requires a specific type of cardiac stress test to confirm, an exercise stress test combined with continuous monitoring. That test was never ordered because no one was looking at her heart. They were looking at her metabolism, her neurology, her immune system. She looked at Nathan directly. I want to order that test today. If I'm right, and I believe I am, we will have a confirmed diagnosis and a treatment pathway within the week. Nathan looked at Dr. Hargrove. Something passed between them, not hostility exactly, but the weight of 14 months sitting in the space between two people who had wanted the same thing and had arrived at very different places. Order the test, Nathan said. The exercise stress test was conducted the following morning. Lily was small and pale in the hospital gown, her dark hair pulled back from her face, and she looked at the equipment around her with the particular courage of a child who has spent enough time in hospitals to have stopped being frightened of machines. Nathan stood outside the observation window. Claire stood beside him. She had come, though she hadn't been asked to, because she had not been able to stay away and no one had told her to leave. 15 minutes into the test, the monitor showed exactly what Dr. Anand had predicted it would show. The confirmation of CPVT came in a quiet room with afternoon light falling through Venetian blinds and making pale stripes across the floor. Dr. Anand explained it again, this time more gently, oriented toward treatment rather than diagnosis. Beta blockers, activity guidelines, regular cardiac monitoring. The medication was well established, well tolerated in children, and had a strong track record. There was a management plan. There was a timeline. There were percentages, good ones, the kind that pointed toward a future. Nathan sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and listened to every word. When Dr. Anand finished, he asked 3 precise questions about medication dosing, long-term monitoring protocols, and the statistical outcomes in pediatric cases. Dr. Anand answered all 3 with the thoroughness of a woman who appreciated being asked precise questions. Then there was a pause, and Nathan looked down at his hands. "She's going to be okay," he said. It was not quite a question. "With proper management, yes," Dr. Anand said. "I fully expect Lily to live a normal, active life. There will be parameters. She'll need to avoid extreme high-intensity exertion. She'll need regular check-ins. But children with well-managed CPVT play sports, they go to school, they grow up." She let that sit for a moment. "She's going to be okay." Nathan pressed his folded hands briefly against his mouth. It was the smallest gesture, barely anything, but Claire saw it, and she looked away to give him the privacy of it. Lily started on beta blockers that same week. The first 2 weeks brought no dramatic transformation. Medicine rarely worked the way it did in movies, with sudden miraculous reversals and immediate visible change. What came instead was gradual, the way real recoveries came. A morning where Lily said she wasn't tired before noon. An afternoon where she sat up in bed and asked her father to bring her the colored pencils from her room at home so she could draw. A day where she walked the full length of the hospital corridor without stopping on her way back. Nathan was there for all of it. He rearranged his schedule in ways that his assistant described later, privately, to colleagues as unprecedented. Moving meetings, delegating decisions he would previously have kept a firm hand on, cancelling a trip to London that had been on the calendar for 3 months. He sat in the chair beside Lily's bed and read to her, and helped her with the drawings she had started making again, and answered her questions about everything with the particular care of a man who had recently been reminded with considerable force that time was not guaranteed. Claire came by the hospital on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the diagnosis. She hadn't planned to. She had finished a shift at Elmhurst, and had told herself she was going to go home and make dinner and help Mason with his reading. But she found herself in the parking lot on the wrong side of the East River and decided to stop in for 20 minutes. She found Nathan in the corridor outside Lily's room, which was where she had found him the first time. But this time he was not standing rigid against the wall with his hands at his sides. He was leaning against the window frame with his arms crossed, and through the glass, visible over his shoulder, Lily was sitting up in bed, drawing something with concentrated intensity, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth, the way children's tongues went when they were working hard at something. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and his face did something it hadn't done in the corridor 3 weeks ago. He smiled. It was a real one, not the controlled social expression she imagined he wore in boardrooms, but something unguarded and genuine that changed his face considerably. "She's been drawing for 2 hours," he said. "She made me promise not to look until it's finished." "Good sign," Claire said. "A very good sign." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for coming." "I was in the area," she said. "You weren't," he said, "but thank you for coming anyway." They stood in the corridor together, and the comfortable quiet between them was different from the desperate quiet of the first night. It had room in it now, room for something other than fear. Claire looked through the window at Lily drawing, at the small focused face and the careful hand moving the colored pencil across the page, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 weeks. "She asked about you," Nathan said. Claire looked at him. "She doesn't know who I am." "I told her," he said simply. "I told her there was a woman who helped us find the right door. Lily asked if you were nice, and I said yes. She asked if you were pretty, and I said also yes. Which I realize in retrospect was an overstep, so I apologize for that." Claire looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she was still learning to read, still learning that beneath the composure and the precision and the controlled steadiness, there was a person who had simply forgotten, somewhere along the way, how to let someone stand close to him. "It's not an overstep," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "There's a dinner, nothing formal, just a restaurant I like in the West Village. I'd like to take you, when Lily is home and settled, which the doctors are saying could be as soon as next week." He paused. "I'm not very good at asking for things that aren't professional in nature. I'm told it's one of my significant character flaws." "I've noticed," she said. "I'll come to dinner." He nodded, and then the door to Lily's room opened, and a small voice said, "Daddy, it's done. You can look now, Bee." And Nathan turned, and Claire turned with him, and Lily was holding up a drawing, 2 figures standing in a corridor, one tall and one small, and above them in careful 9-year-old handwriting the words, "The people who fixed me." Claire looked at the drawing for a long moment. She thought about a 6-year-old girl who had gotten better. She thought about a mother who had refused to stop pushing, and a corridor at 4 in the morning, and a vending machine that had given her 2 coffees when she only needed 1. She thought about the fact that medicine was vast and human and imperfect, and that sometimes the most important things happened, not in consultation rooms or published research papers, but in the small unplanned moments between one person and another. A paper cup extended across a quiet hallway, a question asked honestly, a door that turned out not to be locked after all. "Can I keep this?" she asked Lily. Lily looked at her with Nathan's dark eyes and her mother's particular brand of gravity. "I made it for you," she said, as though this should have been obvious. Claire folded the drawing carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, close to where a receipt with her phone number had once been, and she thought, some things that begin in hospital corridors at 4 in the morning turn out to be exactly where they were always supposed to begin. 3 weeks later, Lily went home. She walked out of New York Presbyterian on a bright October morning, with a small backpack over her shoulders and her father's hand in hers, and she did not stop on the landing.